Can I sit with you? A limping 90-year-old woman asked a ruthless biker. Then this happened. The bell above the diner door rang twice before it went quiet, and that quiet meant only one thing. Damon Crow had walked in. Every regular at Route 9 diner knew the rules without anyone saying them out loud. When the president of the Iron Wolves MC took his usual booth by the window, you didn't wave. You didn't nod. You definitely didn't sit near him. Damon was 6'3" of leather, ink, and silence, the kind of man whose reputation walked into a room a full second before he did. People said he'd buried men who crossed him. People said a lot of things. Damon never bothered correcting any of it. Silence was easier than explaining. He slid into his booth, ordered black coffee like always, and stared out at the highway like it owed him something. That was when the door creaked open a third time. She came in slow, painfully slow, one hand gripping a wooden cane, the other pressed against her hip like it hurt to stand straight. She had to be 90, maybe older. White hair pinned back neat. A faded blue cardigan 2 sizes too big. The kind of woman who looked like she should be home, wrapped in a blanket, not out here alone on a stretch of highway with nothing around for 20 miles but gas stations and regret. The waitress moved to help her, but the old woman waved her off gently and looked straight past every empty booth in the place. Straight at Damon. She shuffled over, cane tapping against the tile, and stopped right in front of his table. Can I sit with you? Damon didn't answer right away. In 18 years of riding, he'd been challenged by rival clubs, cops, and men twice his size looking to make a name off his jaw. Nobody had ever unsettled him with 4 polite words and a limp. There's a whole diner, ma'am, he said, voice flat. Plenty of empty seats that don't come with my company. I know. She was already lowering herself into the seat across from him, wincing as her knees bent. I picked this one anyway. He should have told her move. Instead, something made him go still, a strange, itching feeling, like he already knew her from somewhere he couldn't place. You got a death wish, or it's just bad eyesight? He asked. She smiled, not nervous, not intimidated, amused. Neither. I've been looking for you a long time, Damon. His jaw tightened. I don't know you. No, she agreed softly. But I know you. I knew you when you were small enough to fit in one arm. He almost laughed it off. Almost. Then she did something that stopped the words in his throat completely. She began to hum. Low, quiet, barely audible over the diner's hum of clattering plates and highway traffic outside. But Damon heard every note like it had been carved into his bones. A lullaby. Slow, aching, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten before his mind could even catch up. He hadn't heard that melody in almost 40 years. Where did you hear that? He said. It wasn't a question. It came out sharp, low, dangerous, the voice men in his club knew to back away from. The old woman didn't flinch. Your mother used to sing it to you. Every night before bed. You were maybe for the last time you heard it. Lucky guess, Damon said, though his hands had gone cold around his coffee cup. Is it, she said, tilting her head, also a lucky guess that you have a small crescent-shaped birthmark behind your left ear? Right where your hairline meets your neck. Your mother used to say it looked like a tiny moon. The diner seemed to shrink around him. Nobody knew about that birthmark. Not his club brothers. Not the handful of women who'd passed through his life. It was hidden under his hair, in a spot he could barely see himself in a mirror. He'd stopped thinking about his parents, really thinking about them. Years ago, they died in a fire when he was a kid. That was the story he'd grown up with, told by foster homes and caseworkers who barely remembered his name, let alone his past. He'd built himself out of scar tissue and steel since then. He didn't dig up graves he couldn't fill back in. But this woman just had. Who are you? He said, and this time there was no anger in it. Just something rawer, something close to fear, though Damon Crow hadn't let himself feel that in decades. She reached across the table, and for a moment he thought she might take his hand. Instead, she simply folded her own hands together, steady despite her age, despite the tremble in her voice when she finally spoke. My name is Evelyn Mercer, she said, and there's a great deal about your life, Damon, that you were never told. Some of it will break your heart. Some of it might save it. Before he could respond, she reached for her cane and began to rise, every movement slow and deliberate, like the effort cost her something. Wait, Damon was on his feet before he realized it, blocking her path without meaning to. You can't just say something like that and walk out. I'm not walking out on you, she said gently. I walked toward you. 40 years too late, maybe, but I'm here now. Then explain it. Now, Evelyn shook her head, and for the first time, sadness crossed her face. Old, deep sadness, the kind that lives in a person for decades. Not here. Not like this. There are things you need to see before you'll believe a word I say. She paused at the door, glancing back at him one last time. Meet me tomorrow morning. The Rosewood Nursing Home, 2 miles past the old mill. Ask for Evelyn. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, she said simply. Not yet, but you will. And then she was gone, swallowed by the gray morning light outside, leaving Damon standing alone in the diner with a cold cup of coffee, a lullaby stuck in his throat, and the terrifying, impossible feeling that everything he thought he knew about his own life was about to fall apart. Damon didn't sleep that night. He sat on the back porch of the clubhouse with a bottle he never opened, running his thumb along the edge of his phone, half expecting the whole thing to feel like a joke by morning. Old women didn't hunt down bikers to hum them lullabies. People didn't just walk in off a highway carrying pieces of a life he'd buried on purpose. But the birthmark. Nobody knew about the birthmark. By 8 a.m., he was parked outside Rosewood Nursing Home, engine off, staring at the building like it might bite him. The woman at the front desk barely blinked at the sight of a leather-cut biker asking for Evelyn Mercer. Room 14, she said. She's been waiting since sunrise. Told me you'd come. Evelyn was sitting by the window when he walked in, already dressed, cane resting against her chair like she'd been ready for hours. She didn't look surprised to see him. She looked relieved. I half expected you wouldn't come, she admitted. I almost didn't. He stayed standing, arms crossed, giving himself room to leave if this turned out to be nothing. You've got 5 minutes before I walk out that door. Then I won't waste them talking, Evelyn said, reaching for her cane. I'll show you instead. She led him, slower than he liked, but he matched her pace without complaint. 3 blocks down to the town's public library, a squat brick building that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 70s. The woman at the archive desk greeted Evelyn by name, no questions asked, and pulled a thin gray folder from beneath the counter like she'd been holding it for exactly this moment. I called ahead, Evelyn said, answering the question before Damon could ask it. She opened the folder on a reading table and slid it toward him. Newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to a dull brown. Damon's stomach turned before he even read the headline. Fire claims 2 lives on Meridian Road. Infant survivor feared lost. The date sat at the top like a punch to the throat. 40 years ago. He scanned the article fast, jaw tightening with every line. A house fire. Late at night, a young couple dead, a toddler unaccounted for in the wreckage. No name given. No further articles followed. He stopped, throat suddenly tight. This is supposed to be my parents. The fire that killed them. I was told there was nothing left. No records. Nothing. There wasn't supposed to be, Evelyn said quietly. Someone made sure of that. Damon looked up sharply. What does that mean? Evelyn lowered herself into the chair across from him, folding her hands the same careful way she had in the diner. I was an emergency nurse for 30 years, Damon. That night, I wasn't at any hospital. I was called out to Meridian Road because a neighbor phoned it in before the fire department even arrived. I got there first. And I found you, she said. Alive. Crying, but alive, in the yard, 20 feet from the house, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't burned at all. Someone had carried you out and set you down before the fire fully took hold. Someone who didn't want you found with the bodies. The room seemed to tilt under Damon's feet. That's not possible. I was told there were no survivors pulled from that fire. That's the story I grew up with. Because I made sure of it, Evelyn said, and for the first time her voice cracked. I heard men's voices before I found you. Men who weren't firefighters, weren't neighbors. They were searching the property, quiet, careful, like they were looking for something specific. Or someone. I didn't wait to find out who they were. I took you. I left before anyone official arrived, and I told no one what I'd seen. If I had gone through normal channels, if I had let the county know a child survived, You would have gone straight into a system that men like that could have found in a single afternoon. Damon's hands had curled into fists without him noticing. You're saying somebody wanted to kill a baby. I'm saying somebody wanted to make sure that fire had no witnesses, Evelyn said. And you were one. He wanted to call it insane. He wanted to walk out of that library and never think about it again. But the story lined up too well with the twisted, empty spaces in his own memory, the lack of records, the vague foster file that started with no explanation, like his life had simply begun the night of that fire with no past attached to it. Prove it, he said, voice low. Prove you were actually there. Prove this isn't some story you built from an old newspaper clipping. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, like she'd been waiting for exactly that challenge. You carried a small wooden horse everywhere as a toddler, she said finally. Hand-carved, rough edges, one ear chipped off because you used to chew on it when you were teething. It was in the blanket with you that night. I kept it in a drawer for 38 years because I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, and I couldn't figure out how to give it back. Damon went completely still. Nobody knew about the horse. Not the club. Not a single case worker in 18 years of foster paperwork. It was a memory so old and so small he'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. A splinter of wood worn smooth under a 4-year-old's teeth, lost somewhere between one house and the next. I need to sit down, he said quietly, and for the first time since the diner, Damon Crow looked less like a man who ran a biker club and more like a boy standing at the edge of a fire, finally being told the truth about the night his whole world burned down. Damon didn't go back to the clubhouse that night. He stayed in a motel 2 towns over, staring at the ceiling, turning a splinter of memory over and over in his mind. A wooden horse with a chipped ear, a detail so small and so private that no lie could have manufactured it. By morning, he'd made a decision. He wasn't running from this. He was going to see it through. Evelyn was waiting outside Rosewood when he pulled up, dressed and ready despite the early hour, a manila envelope clutched against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. There's more, she said, before he'd even cut the engine. Something your parents left behind. Something they hid on purpose. Hid from whom? That's what we're about to find out. She directed him 40 minutes out of town to a squat limestone building on a near-empty street. Fairview Trust, one of those old regional banks that had somehow survived every merger and closure that swallowed up its competitors. The sign out front looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. My parents banked here? Damon asked, killing the engine. Your parents did more than bank here, Evelyn said. They planned here. Your father wasn't a fool, Damon. He knew something was coming before it did. Inside, Evelyn approached the counter with a confidence that surprised him. No hesitation, no fumbling. She slid a folded document across to the teller, along with an old brass key that looked like it belonged in a museum. I have documentation naming me temporary legal guardian of Damon Crow, formerly registered under a different name in the event of his parents' incapacitation, she said. Box 214. I believe it's still active. The teller disappeared for several long minutes. Damon stood rigid beside Evelyn, arms crossed, jaw tight, half expecting to be told the box didn't exist, that this whole thing would collapse the way every fragile hope in his life eventually did. Instead, the teller returned with a thin ledger and a look of quiet disbelief. It's been paid through automatic transfer for 40 years, she said. Someone set up the account so it would never lapse. My father, Evelyn said softly, and for the first time Damon realized she meant his father, not her own. He didn't know exactly what he was preparing for, but he wanted to make sure that whatever happened, there'd be a way for the truth to survive him. They were led to a private room in the back, walls lined with steel boxes, the air thick with the smell of old paper and older secrets. The teller inserted 2 keys, turned them together, and slid a long metal box onto the table before leaving them alone. Damon's hand hovered over the lid for a moment before he opened it. Inside was a life he'd never been allowed to know. Photographs first. A young couple, laughing, a baby held between them. The resemblance to Damon's own face, so exact it knocked the air out of him. His mother had his eyes. His father had his jaw, his stubborn set of the mouth. There were birth certificates, his real name printed in careful ink, a name he hadn't used since before he could walk. Handwritten letters, folded and refolded, so many times the creases had gone soft. And at the bottom, wrapped in a cloth pouch, an old cassette tape. "There's no player in this room," Evelyn said, watching his face. "But I have one at Rosewood. Your father recorded that not long before the fire. I never listened to it. I always felt it wasn't mine to hear." Damon picked up one of the letters instead, hands unsteady in a way that would have shocked every man in his club. His father's handwriting was neat, urgent, like it had been written in a hurry. "If you're reading this, something has gone wrong, and I need you to understand. We didn't choose this fight. It chose us. The people we worked for aren't just running trucks. There's more moving through that company than freight, and once we found out, we couldn't unknow it. I've hidden what I can. Protect our son. He's the only thing that matters now." Damon set the letter down slowly, his throat too tight to speak. "Your father ran a trucking company," Evelyn said gently. "Crow and Sons Freight. It was respected once. Then it wasn't. What happened to it? It collapsed within a year of the fire. Sold off in pieces to companies that didn't ask questions about where the money came from." Evelyn's eyes were fixed on the box, on the photographs of a family that had been erased so thoroughly the world forgot it existed. "Your parents weren't victims of some accident, Damon. They found something inside that company they weren't supposed to find, and they were killed for it." The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls of steel boxes pressing in around him. Every version of himself he'd built, the orphan, the outlaw, the man with no history worth mentioning, cracked down the middle. "Oh," Damon said, voice low and dangerous in a way that hadn't surfaced in years. "Did this to my family?" Evelyn looked at him with something between grief and grim determination. "I don't have a name yet, but I think the answer is still out there, waiting in the one place your parents worked their whole lives." She closed the lid of the box gently, like she was closing a casket. "The depot. That's where we go next." The old Crow and Sons depot sat at the edge of an industrial stretch outside town, half swallowed by weeds, its metal roof rusted through in patches like old wounds that never healed right. A faded sign still hung above the main gate, letters peeling but legible enough. "Crow and Sons Freight, IST 1974. Damon stood at the gate for a long moment before he could make himself walk through it. "You don't have to come in," Evelyn said, watching him carefully. "Yeah," Damon said. "Edo." The place had been picked clean by scrappers in time, most of the trucks long gone, sold or scrapped decades ago. But the front office building still stood, windows shattered, walls tagged with graffiti that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't grown up sneaking in here as kids. Evelyn moved through it like she'd studied a map beforehand, leading Damon past the reception desk to a back room that had once been his father's office. "Your father kept a second set of books," Evelyn said, running a hand along a rusted filing cabinet. "Not the ones the company used publicly. I found a reference to them in one of the letters we didn't get to yesterday. He mentioned a hiding place, somewhere only family would think to check." It took them almost 20 minutes of searching before Damon noticed it. A loose floor panel beneath where his father's desk would have sat, the wood slightly discolored compared to the boards around it. He pried it up with a tire iron he'd grabbed from his bike, and beneath it sat a rusted metal box, smaller than the one from the bank, but heavier with paper. Inside were shipping manifests, dates circled in red ink, routes that didn't match any legitimate freight run. Names Damon didn't recognize penciled in the margins next to numbers that looked less like cargo weights and more like payments. "Your father was documenting something," Evelyn murmured, flipping through page after page. "Building a case." He knew exactly what he'd stumbled into. That was when Damon heard it. The scrape of boots on gravel outside, too deliberate to be the wind, too careful to be a stray animal. "Get down," he said, already moving, pulling Evelyn away from the window by instinct alone. Through a gap in the boarded glass, he counted 3 men moving across the lot, spread out, checking corners like they'd done this kind of work before. Not scrappers, not cops, professionals. "They followed us," Evelyn whispered, and for the first time since he'd met her, Damon heard real fear in her voice. Not for herself, he realized, but for the box of papers clutched against her chest. "They've been watching me for weeks. I thought I'd lost them." "Watching you, why?" Because I started asking questions again, she admitted. After I found you, after I realized you'd survived and built a life for yourself, I told myself I'd leave it alone. But 3 months ago, I couldn't anymore. I started digging. I didn't think anyone was still paying attention after 40 years. Somebody was. Damon's phone was already out, one thumb dialing a number he knew by heart. 2 rings before Reno picked up, his sergeant at arms, a man who'd bled for the club more than once and never asked why. I need eyes on the Old Crow Depot now. Bring Tank and Whistler. We've got company that isn't friendly. The men outside were closing in on the office building by the time Damon ended the call, moving with the kind of coordinated patience that told him this wasn't a random break-in. They wanted what was inside that box, and they weren't planning to ask nicely. There's a service exit, Evelyn said suddenly, surprising him. Behind the old loading bay. Your father showed it to me once, back at the beginning. Employees used it during shift changes. You've been here before. Once. A long time ago. There was something in her voice he didn't have time to unpack, a weight of old grief tangled with old memory. They moved fast through the depot's guts, Evelyn slower on her cane, but refusing to be carried, gritting through the pain with a stubbornness that matched anything Damon had seen in his own club brothers. They reached the loading bay just as the sound of splintering wood echoed from the front office. The men breaking in, finding it empty, realizing their targets had already slipped free. Headlights swung into the lot seconds later. Reno's bike first, followed by 2 more, engines roaring loud enough to scatter the men in suits back toward a black sedan parked half a block down. By the time Damon's brothers reached the depot gates, the sedan was already peeling away, taillights disappearing around the industrial park's far corner. Reno pulled up beside Damon, cutting his engine, eyes flicking between his president and the frail old woman leaning hard on her cane, breathing ragged from the run. You want to tell me what the hell that was? Damon looked down at the rusted box, still clutched in Evelyn's arms. Evidence his father had died, trying to protect. Evidence someone was still willing to chase down a 90-year-old woman to bury. Later, Damon said, voice hard as iron. Right now, we get her somewhere safe. For the first time since the diner, since the lullaby, since the birthmark that had cracked his whole world open, Damon understood something with total clarity. Evelyn Mercer hadn't walked into his life to bring him danger. She'd been standing between him and it for 40 years, and she was still standing there now. The cabin belonged to Whistler's uncle, a retired iron wolf who'd traded his cut for a quiet life in the mountains 20 years back. It sat at the end of a dirt road so rough that even Damon's bike struggled with it, tucked into a stand of pines where no black sedan would find them without a fight. Evelyn sat by the fireplace that evening wrapped in a wool blanket someone had dug out of a closet, her cane resting against the stone hearth, her face lit orange by the flames. She looked smaller than she had at the diner, smaller than she had at the bank, like the last 2 days had finally caught up with all 90 of her years at once. Damon poured 2 mugs of coffee and sat across from her without a word, waiting. He learned by now that Evelyn talked when she was ready, not before. You want to know how I raised a child that wasn't mine without anyone finding out? She said finally, not question. It's been sitting behind your eyes since the depot. Yeah, Damon admitted. It has. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her mug, staring into the fire like the story lived somewhere in the flames. After I pulled you out of that yard, I didn't go home. I didn't go to the hospital where I worked. I drove 3 hours to a town where nobody knew my face and checked into a motel with a baby who wasn't mine and no plan beyond keeping you breathing until morning. You could have gone to the police. I thought about it, she said, for about an hour. Then I remembered the sound of those men's voices in the yard, calm and organized, like they did this kind of work often. Men like that don't stop looking because a report gets filed. They stop looking when the trail goes cold enough to convince them it isn't worth the effort anymore. She looked up at him. So I made the trail go cold. Over the next hour, in a voice that grew steadier the longer she spoke, Evelyn told him everything. How she'd used old contacts from her nursing days, a doctor who owed her a favor, a county clerk who didn't ask too many questions, to place him quietly into the foster system under a different name, with records vague enough that nobody chasing a specific missing child would ever connect the dots. How she'd moved twice in his first 2 years, just to be sure. How she'd never taken him in herself, because a woman suddenly appearing with an infant in the same window as a deadly house fire would have been the loosest thread anyone could pull. "I wanted to keep you," she said quietly. "God, I wanted to. But keeping you close was the most dangerous thing I could have done. Loving you from a distance was the only way to keep you alive." Damon sat with that for a long moment, the fire popping softly between them. "You said you checked on me. Growing up. Every year," Evelyn said. "Sometimes twice. I kept track of which home you were in, which school. I never approached you. Never spoke to you. I watched you from parking lots and bleachers and church parking lots on adoption days that never came for you, and every single time I told myself it was enough just to know you were still breathing." "That's not enough," Damon said, harder than he meant to. "That's not a life. That's 40 years of watching from a distance, because you were scared." "Yes," Evelyn said simply, no defense in her voice at all. "I was scared. I'm still scared. I have spent 4 decades scared, Damon, and I would do every single year of it again, because the alternative was a version of this story where you don't get to sit in this cabin arguing with me tonight." The anger drained out of him as quickly as it had come, replaced by something heavier, something that sat low in his chest like guilt he hadn't earned but felt anyway. He thought about every group home he'd aged out of, every caseworker who'd looked at him like a file instead of a kid, every night he'd told himself nobody in the world had ever truly wanted him around. The whole time someone had. "I called you a liar," he said quietly. "In that diner. I looked at you like you were some con artist working an angle. You had every right to," Evelyn said. "I was a stranger who knew things a stranger shouldn't know." Suspicion was the smart response, Damon, not the cruel 1 inch. You gave up half your life for a kid you pulled out of fire once. Nobody does that. Not really. Not for 40 years straight. Evelyn's eyes were bright in the firelight, and for the first time since he'd met her, they were wet at the edges. "I didn't have children of my own. Never married, never had the chance, or maybe never made the chance. It's hard to say which, this far out. And then one night, I found a baby in a burning yard, and something in me decided that was reason enough to keep going." You didn't just survive that fire, Damon. You gave an old woman a reason to keep living for 40 more years. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere down the mountain, a truck engine growled faint and distant, though whether it belonged to friend or enemy, neither of them could say. Damon reached across the small space between their chairs and, for the first time, took Evelyn's frail hand in his own scarred, tattooed one. "Nobody's watching from a distance anymore," he said. "Not you. Not me. We finished this together." By morning, Evelyn had a name to give him. Frank Delacroix, retired detective, one of 2 officers who'd caught the original fire case 40 years ago, back when it was still being investigated instead of buried. She'd tracked him down months earlier during her own quiet search, long before she'd worked up the courage to find Damon himself. "He wouldn't talk to me at first," Evelyn said as Damon's bike idled outside a small house on the edge of the city. An old woman showing up with questions about a cold case doesn't exactly inspire confidence. "But I wore him down eventually. He agreed to testify if it ever came to that. Said he'd been waiting 40 years for someone to finally ask him the right questions." Frank turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in his 70s, gray-bearded, sharp-eyed, despite his age, the kind of retired cop who still checked his mirrors twice out of habit. He let them in without much surprise, like he'd been expecting this visit for longer than made sense. "Crow and Sons," he said, settling into a worn armchair, studying Damon's face like he was matching it against a memory. "You've got your father's eyes. I interviewed him twice before the fire. Good man. Scare man by the end." "Scared of what?" Damon asked. "Of the people he worked for," Frank said. "Officially, your father owned that trucking company outright. Unofficially, there were investors nobody talked about openly, men who used those trucks to move things that had nothing to do with freight. Your father found out. He came to me with records, wanting to build a case quiet enough that his family wouldn't get caught in the blowback. But he did anyway," Damon said, voice flat. The case got shut down from above before I could touch it, Frank said, bitterness sharpening his voice even after 40 years. 2 days later, your parents were dead, and every piece of paperwork I'd started disappeared from department records like it never existed. I got reassigned to traffic enforcement a month after that. Nobody explained why. Nobody had to. Evelyn leaned forward. Will you say all of this on record, Frank? Formally, if it comes to that. I've been waiting 40 years for someone to ask, Frank said. Yes, whatever it takes. They agreed to meet again in 2 days. Once Damon had time to reach out to a lawyer his club trusted, someone who could start the process of taking this to people who couldn't be bought off with a phone call. Damon left that house feeling something close to hope for the first time since the diner. The call came the next morning, before sunrise, Frank's daughter on the line, voice shaking so badly Damon could barely understand her at first. Frank had been attacked outside his own home. A car had run him down in his driveway, deliberate, precise, then vanished before any neighbor got a clear look at the plates. He was alive, barely, in critical condition at City Memorial, and the moment Damon heard the words hit and run, he knew exactly what it really was. They reached the hospital within the hour, Evelyn moving faster on her cane than Damon had ever seen her move, fear driving her past whatever pain slowed her down on ordinary days. Frank was conscious when they were finally allowed into his room, bruised and wired to machines, but alert enough to grip Damon's hand with surprising strength. They found out I was talking, Frank rasped. Which means they're getting nervous. Which means we're closer than I thought. You need to rest, Evelyn said gently, though her eyes were wet. I need you to listen, Frank said, cutting her off with what little force he had left. There's someone else. Someone I never told anyone about, because he begged me not to. A mechanic, Walt Higgins. He worked on the getaway vehicle used the week of the murders. Saw things he wasn't supposed to see. I let him disappear because I thought it would keep him alive. He's been living under a different name for decades, working odd jobs at a little church outside Millbrook. If you want the full truth, he's the last piece of it. Damon exchanged a look with Evelyn, the same understanding passing silently between them. There was no time to waste. Within the hour, Damon, Evelyn, and Reno were on the road toward Millbrook, a quiet farming town an hour outside the city, home to a small whitewashed church that looked like it hadn't changed in half a century. They found Walt Higgins in the church garden, an elderly man in overalls trimming rose bushes with the careful patience of someone who'd spent 40 years trying to disappear into small, ordinary tasks. He didn't run when he saw them coming. He simply set down his shears, wiped his hands on his overalls, and said, I always figured someone would come eventually. Inside the quiet of the church office, with afternoon light slanting through stained glass, Walt confirmed everything Frank had risked his life to say. He'd repaired the truck used the night of the murders, found blood in the wheel well 2 days later, and gone straight to the police out of guilt, only to be quietly warned by Frank himself that talking any louder would get him killed. He'd taken the warning seriously. He'd been running from his own conscience for 40 years. Your parents weren't caught up in something they didn't understand, Walt said, looking Damon dead in the eye. They found out exactly what that company was moving, and they refused to keep quiet about it. That refusal is what got them killed. Whoever gave that order back then is still out there, Damon. And after what happened to Frank, I'd bet good money they're still protecting themselves. Walt gave them one more piece before they left the church that afternoon, an address he'd carried in his memory for 40 years without ever daring to visit it himself. The Old Crow family home, out past the county line, abandoned since the fire and never sold, tangled up for decades in legal limbo because no living relative had ever come forward to claim it. Until now, the house sat at the end of an overgrown driveway, half swallowed by ivy, its porch sagging under decades of neglect. Damon killed his engine and sat there a long moment, staring at it, feeling something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with danger. This is where it happened, he said quietly. Not a question. Yes, Evelyn said, just as quiet. I haven't been back since that night. I didn't think I ever would. They went in together, Reno posted outside as a lookout, flashlight beams cutting through dust and shadow. The fire 40 years ago had gutted the east wing entirely, But the rest of the house had survived in eerie, frozen stillness. Furniture draped in sheets, a child's room untouched, a small wooden crib still standing in the corner like it was waiting for someone who never came back. Damon stood in that doorway longer than he meant to. It was Evelyn who found the loose floorboard, kneeling with obvious pain in the room that had once been his father's study, running her palm along a seam in the wood that didn't quite match the boards around it. A trick, Damon realized, that his father had used twice now, once at the depot and once here, like a man who trusted hidden spaces more than he trusted the world above them. Beneath the floor was a small leather satchel, and inside it, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, sat his mother's diary. Damon opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. The handwriting was smaller than his father's, more careful, filled with the ordinary details of a life interrupted. Grocery lists, a recipe for something his mother had never gotten to make again, notes about a 4-year-old boy's first steps, his favorite foods, the sound of his laugh. And then, in the final pages, the entries changed. Frank came by again tonight. He says the department can't move fast enough to protect us if this comes out publicly. James says we have to keep gathering evidence quietly, keep smiling at dinners with men we now know are monsters until we have enough to bring the whole thing down at once. I'm so afraid. Not for myself. For Damon. If something happens to us, I need him to know we didn't run. We stood up. I hope that's a kind of inheritance worth having. Beneath the diary sat a set of financial ledgers, names and figures inked in his father's meticulous hand, tracing money through Crow and Son's freight into the accounts of men whose names Damon recognized instantly. Not from the trucking world, but from the town itself. A county commissioner, a prominent local judge, the founder of a real estate firm that still had its name on half the buildings downtown. Respected men, powerful men who'd spent 40 years hiding behind reputations built on the silence of a murdered family. This is enough, Evelyn breathed, flipping through page after page. This is finally enough to bring it all down. That was when Reno's voice crackled through the radio outside, sharp with alarm. Boss, we've got a problem. Multiple vehicles coming up the drive fast. Damon shoved the diary and ledgers into the satchel and grabbed Evelyn's arm, half carrying her toward the front of the house as headlights swept across the overgrown yard outside. 3 vehicles this time, more men than the depot, moving with the urgency of people who understood exactly what was at stake now that the evidence had finally surfaced. They're not here to steal anything, Reno said grimly. Watching from the porch as 2 men circled toward the back of the house with something in their hands that glinted orange in the dying light. They're here to burn it. The first flames caught along the east wing within minutes, old dry wood and decades of neglect turning the fire into something hungry and fast. Damon half-dragged Evelyn down the porch steps as smoke began pouring from the upstairs windows, the same house that had nearly killed him once now, trying to finish the job it had started 40 years ago. The satchel, Evelyn gasped, stumbling on the uneven ground. Damon, if we lose that, we're not losing anything, Damon said, pulling her toward his bike as Reno and 2 more club brothers who'd arrived moments earlier moved to intercept the men circling the property, engines roaring to life, headlights slicing through smoke and chaos. It took less than 10 minutes for the fight to end. The arsonists scattering the moment they realized they were outnumbered and outgunned, engines screaming away into the dark, leaving the old Crow house to burn behind them, flames finally consuming what should have burned completely 40 years earlier. Damon stood at the end of the driveway, with Evelyn safe beside him, the satchel clutched tight against his chest, watching his childhood home collapse into embers and ash. They just told us everything we needed to know, he said quietly, watching the fire climb higher against the night sky. You don't burn a house down over nothing, Evelyn. You burn it down when you're finally, truly scared. Evelyn touched his arm, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Then let's give them a reason to be. 3 days passed in a blur of lawyers, locked doors, and careful planning. Damon's club had a contact from years back, a federal attorney named Marisol Vega who'd once helped clear a member wrongly tied to a case that wasn't his. And when Damon laid the satchel's contents across her desk, she went quiet for a long time before finally looking up. "This isn't a cold case anymore," she said. "This is a conspiracy that's been running for 40 years, protected by men who still hold power in this county today. If we're doing this, we're not doing it small. We're doing it federal, and we're doing it fast before anyone else connected to this decides burning down a house wasn't enough." It took 2 days to arrange protection for everyone involved. Frank, still recovering in the hospital, but well enough to give a statement. Walt, brought in under federal escort from Millbrook. Evelyn, who refused a wheelchair despite everyone's protests and insisted on walking into that courthouse on her own 2 feet. Cane and all. Damon's club provided quiet security the whole way, parked outside every safe house, riding escort on every transport, a wall of leather and steel around the people the system had failed to protect the first time. The federal courthouse downtown was nothing like Damon expected. No dramatic finale, no courtroom drama with a jury holding its breath. Just quiet rooms, careful questions, agents combing through ledgers and shipping manifests with the patient thoroughness of people who understood exactly what they were looking at. Names came off his father's records one by one, cross-referenced against decades of financial filings, land deals, and quietly buried complaints that had never gone anywhere until now. The county commissioner was arrested first, taken from his own office in handcuffs, while local news cameras caught every second of it. The judge followed 2 days later, his resignation letter released to the press before the arrest warrant even finished processing. The real estate developer tried to flee the state and made it exactly 40 miles before federal agents pulled him over on a quiet stretch of highway. Damon sat through every interview, every statement, watching decades of buried lies come apart thread by thread. Frank testified from hospital bed, voice weak but steady, laying out everything he'd known and been silenced from saying 40 years earlier. Walt spoke about the blood in the wheel well, the warning that sent him into hiding for half his life. Evelyn testified last, her voice small in that enormous room but never once wavering, describing a burning yard, a crying baby, and 40 years spent protecting a secret she'd carried entirely alone. "I'm not here for revenge," she told the room, hands folded the same careful way she always held them. "I am here because a family was erased, and their son deserves to know exactly who they were and exactly why they died. Silence has protected these men for 40 years. I am done being part of that silence." Damon testified too, though there was little he could offer beyond what he'd learned in the last 10 days. A birthmark, a lullaby, a wooden horse with a chipped ear, a childhood built entirely on lies he'd never chosen. It was enough. Combined with the ledgers, the diary, the cassette tape finally played aloud in a quiet federal office. His father's voice, calm and steady, naming names and dates with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was risking and did it anyway. The case built itself into something no lawyer, no bought judge, no 40 years of silence could unravel anymore. The arrest continued through the week. 7 men total, some minor players finally willing to testify against the others in exchange for lighter sentences, the entire rotten structure that had protected his parents' killers collapsing under its own weight once enough light finally hit it. On the final day, Marisol Vega called Damon into her office with paperwork he hadn't expected, a formal declaration clearing his parents' names, officially recognizing James and Anna Crow not as accident victims, but as whistleblowers murdered for refusing to stay silent about criminal activity within their own company. Attached to it was a second document, one that took Damon several long minutes to fully understand. The surviving assets of Crow and Sons Freight, seized and frozen for decades in legal limbo, were being formally released and returned to him as the sole surviving heir. "It's not much anymore," Marisol said gently. "The company's long gone. But the land, some of the equipment, whatever remains, it's yours. It always should have been." Damon stood outside the courthouse that evening with Evelyn beside him, the last of the arrests finalized, the last of the paperwork signed. Reporters had started gathering by the steps, drawn by a story too strange and too emotional to ignore: a biker club president, a 90-year-old rescuer, a 40-year-old murder finally solved. Damon ignored every camera, every shouted question, and turned instead to the woman who'd walked into his life 8 days earlier with nothing but a cane, a lullaby, and a truth she'd carried alone for 4 decades. "You did this," he said quietly. "All of it. You could have stayed quiet forever. Nobody would have blamed you. I stopped being able to stay quiet the moment I saw you sitting in that diner," Evelyn said, her eyes bright in the fading evening light. 40 years is long enough to carry something alone, Damon. I'm just glad I finally got to put it down with someone who could carry it with me." For the first time in decades, Evelyn Mercer stood in the open, in public, under her own name, with nothing left to hide and no one left to fear. A month passed before Damon finally felt ready to go back to Meridian Road. The house was gone now. Nothing left but a scorched foundation and the slow creep of weeds reclaiming what the fire had left behind. But the hill overlooking it, the quiet rise of grass where his parents had been buried 40 years ago under names half the town had forgotten, that was still there, still waiting, exactly as it had been the entire time Damon didn't know it existed. He picked Evelyn up from Rosewood himself that morning, helping her into the passenger seat of a truck instead of his bike because the doctor had warned that the vibration wasn't good for her hips anymore, and because some part of him had started treating her like family worth being careful with. She wore the same faded blue cardigan she'd had on the day she walked into that diner, and when Damon caught sight of it, something in his chest ached in a way he'd stopped letting himself feel a long time ago. "You didn't have to come today," he said, pulling onto the old county road. "It's a hard climb up that hill." "I've made harder climbs," Evelyn said simply. 40 years of them, if we're counting. The hilltop was quiet when they arrived, wind moving soft through tall grass, the kind of stillness that felt earned rather than empty. 2 modest headstones stood side by side near the crest of the hill, James Crow and Anna Crow, dates carved beneath their names, no mention anywhere of the lie the world had told about them for 4 decades. Beside them sat a third, newer stone, delivered and placed only days earlier, the granite still sharp-edged and unweathered compared to the 2 beside it. Damon knelt down and brushed a hand across his mother's name. Feeling the stone chase away decades of numbness he hadn't realized he'd been carrying his whole life. "I used to think I didn't have anyone," he said quietly, not quite looking at Evelyn, not quite looking at anything. "Not really. Foster homes don't exactly teach a kid to believe in family. I built the club instead, told myself brothers by choice were better than blood you never got to choose. And they are good men. But I always figured I started from nothing. No story. No people who wanted me before I was old enough to be useful to anybody." "You didn't start from nothing," Evelyn said, lowering herself carefully onto the small stone bench beside the graves, cane resting against her knee. "You started from 2 people who loved you enough to die, protecting the truth about who they were. And you had someone watching over you every single year after, even if you never knew her name until a few weeks ago." Damon finally looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite let himself since that first morning at the nursing home, when he still half believed this was some elaborate con. "You gave me back a family I thought was gone forever, Evelyn. My parents. Their names. The truth about what happened to them. I don't know how a person is supposed to say thank you for something like that." "You don't have to say it," Evelyn said, her voice thick. "You just have to let me stay a part of whatever comes next. That's all the thanks I've ever wanted." Damon reached into his jacket and pulled out the small object he'd been carrying since the morning, the one he'd had made in secret over the last 2 weeks, and set it gently at the base of the new headstone beside his parents' graves. Carved into the granite, simple and permanent, were 4 words. "Our guardian forever." Evelyn stared at it for a long moment, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears finally slipping free after decades of holding herself together through fires and courtrooms and 40 years of silent, distant love. "I never had children of my own," she whispered. "I used to think that meant I'd go through this whole life without ever really being anyone's family. Turns out I just had to wait a very long time to find mine." "You found him the night you pulled a crying baby out of a burning yard," Damon said, kneeling beside her bench, taking her frail hand in his own scarred one the way he had that first night at the cabin. "You just didn't get to keep him until now." Below the hill, Reno's bike rumbled up the dirt road, followed by half a dozen more from the club, engines cutting to silence one by one as the iron wolves gathered at the base of the hill in quiet, unspoken tribute. Men who understood loyalty better than most, come to stand watch over the woman who'd spent 4 decades standing watch over their president before any of them had ever known his real name. Damon looked out over the valley, the ashes of the old house, the road that had once carried a dying family and a rescued child away from danger, and finally, 40 years late, towards safety. "Nobody's ever going to make you disappear again," he said, helping Evelyn to her feet as the wind moved gentle across the hilltop. "You spent half your life protecting me from the shadows. Let me spend whatever's left making sure you never have to hide in them again." Evelyn Mercer smiled, not the careful, guarded smile of a woman who'd spent 40 years watching from a distance, but something open, something finally, fully at peace. And together, surrounded by a family neither of them had expected but both of them had finally earned, they turned and began the slow walk back down the hill.